Hello, Read Through the Word, friends. My name is Dawn, and I am so glad to be with you here today on Read Through the Word. We are back to the beginning of the year, back to January, back to Genesis, starting the whole year over again, and I'm looking forward to just exploring again with you another year of Read Through the Word. So today is January 11th, and the title for the lesson today is God's Purposes. The key verse we're going to take from Genesis 31, verses 4 through 7. So Jacob called Rachel and Leah out to the field where he was watching his flock. He said to them, "I have noticed that your father's attitude toward me has changed, but the God of my father has been with me. You know how hard I have worked for your father, but he has cheated me, changing my wages 10 times. But God has not allowed him to do me any harm." Such a powerful statement there, right? A statement of, I guess, a statement of grief, a grievance against Laban, whom we know has genuinely cheated Jacob, and a statement of, understanding his situation has changed and he will continue to be treated unfairly, as Laban has shown. And not only that, but he is trusting God in this statement that God is going to continue to work out his good purposes for Jacob. So, but how that looks ends up being kind of interesting. So let's dig in here. And do excuse a little bit. I'm still a little hoarse from getting over a cold. I know many of you can probably relate. So just a couple interesting things here that are really important to understand in background. And we've chatted about this before, but Jacob was part of a culture, the general ancient Near Eastern world culture. And when we see people in the Bible making certain decisions or having certain thoughts, they are genuinely, there's a genuineness, I think, among many of these people to understand who this God is, who has set himself above all pagan gods, who has proclaimed himself sovereign above all these other pagan gods. And I really feel like the Old Testament is a way for, it's how these people are working out who is this God and what does it mean for our lives? How do we trust him? How do we live for him? But in the midst, they live within their culture, not within a vacuum. And so their culture still influences things that they think, things that they do. Sometimes it's just a cultural idea that kind of works itself out over time, and sometimes it's genuinely harmful. So let's talk a little bit about the culture of that day. We know that the issue, that there was an issue with Rachel not conceiving at first, but Leah was, and then Rachel did, and then Leah did, and back and forth. And we need to understand that during this time period, a woman's status was very tentative if she did not bear children. A barren woman could be, and often was, discarded, ostracized, given a lower status, and she relied on her family for protection. And a man could divorce his wife if she was barren. So the situation for women was difficult. And, I think we see not only was it desperate for both Rachel and Leah to have children, and the lengths that they went to have children, right, with their having Jacob have children with their servants. But we have to remember too that Jacob was not just an innocent bystander in this, okay? He was not just an innocent bystander. So yes, we do see that there is a faith that Jacob has in the one true God, but he also took matters into his own hands sometimes, didn't he? He took matters into his own hands to get the blessing away from Esau, to make sure his wives had children. And And we get to this part of the story where he is wanting to separate his flocks from Laban's. And of course, Laban again cheats him. Laban's sons take the flocks that should have gone to Jacob, the colored, the speckled, and then the black sheep, the colored and the speckled goats and the black sheep. And so Jacob tries to begin to breed the colored, the kind of sheep that he told Laban would be his. Now, the coloring of goats and sheep chosen by Jacob typically made up actually a small proportion of a herd at that time. And certain methods could help breed healthy animals and strengthen the herd. However, this quote from the InterVarsity Press Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament, what is not scientific, however, is the principle that certain characteristics, coloration in this case, can be bred for through visual arts. The stripped rod which Jacob places before the troughs of the sheep cannot genetically affect the sheep. So this kind of thinking was found in many ancient folk traditions. I also put a link there for you, gotquestions.org, and it talks about this whole issue of Jacob, trying to, practice this method, this breeding practice in order to get what he wanted. And this article too kind of talks about this is not a scientific thing. This is more a folk tradition, folklore, right? But what's interesting is that David didn't need it. He didn't need these kind of folklore practices to try to make this work. Well, how do we know that? Well, in Genesis 31, verses 10 through 12, Jacob is talking to his wives, and he says, one time during the mating season, I had a dream and saw that the male goats mating with the females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then in my dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob, and I replied, yes, here I am. The angel said, look up, and you will see that only the streaked, speckled, and spotted males are mating with the females of your flock, for I have seen how Laban has treated you. So Jacob was already given a promise. What you're going to see before you is this flock, right? That I am going to grow, that God is going to grow, that God is going to expand and bring about, because God has seen how Jacob has been treated. So, did Jacob trust God? I believe he did. But he still went and kind of took matters into his own hands to some extent. He still decided, oh, God's going to do this for me. I better get in there and I better make sure this happens. I've got to, practice these ancient traditions that I've learned about so I can make this happen. And there's no evidence that God told him these methods, because sometimes I have seen sort of the argument or read the argument that, well, God probably gave him these methods. There's no evidence for that in the text at all. God simply says, this is what's going to happen. This is what's coming. And, that God is going to bless this flock of Jacob's goats and sheep. And there's no evidence that God would tell him to do that, or that God did tell him to do that. So this is not the first time we've seen Jacob sort of take matters into his own hands. And he didn't need to. We also see this, interestingly enough, with Rachel. When they leave Laban's care to, when Jacob, they secretly leave, and Rachel steals the household gods. Household gods were associated with luck and prosperity of the family. It doesn't mean that she didn't believe in the one true God, but again, there was still something that made her believe these little idols were going to be a part of her prosperity, a part of, her family, a part of luck or wealth for her and for her family. And so she too continued to practice some things that were cultural, but weren't what God asked her to do either. So, Jacob trusted in God, but still he took matters sometimes into his own hands. He tried to utilize cultural tradition to accomplish what God had already purposed to do. So what can we do about that? Well, if God has called you in a certain direction, or if he has made a promise, or if God has spoken to you about something, then we need to trust he's going to do what he says. Now, are there times that we come alongside and we do something that God called us to do? In other words, there are times God speaks to us about something and we have a role to play in it, right? Because faith is not just believing, it's doing. So sometimes there's a role that we play in certain things. Maybe like a ministry. We can't just sit and pray that the ministry would happen forever. We have to go out and do something, right? But it always needs to be in line with what God is asking us to do. In other words, Jacob went ahead with what he thought was best according to his culture to help God along to fulfill this promise. And that wasn't what God was asking him to do. So it's really important to discern, number one, trust God with the plan that he has spoken to us, with what he's told us, with the way he's leading us, and discern, is what I'm doing part of what God's asking me to do, within his calling? Or is what I'm doing taking matters into my own hands when I just need to trust that God will do as he said? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me here today, friends, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.